Comic books. That's how I learned to read. Being born to a 16-year-old mom and raised by my grandparents in Orangeburg, we made do with the opportunities we created for ourselves, because that's all we had. My story is my story. Lindsey Graham's story is just comical.
Donald Trump, I think he's a kook. I think he's crazy. His policies are really bad for the country. He's not fit to be president of the United States. He's a race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot. No, I don't think he's a xenophobic, race-baiting, religious bigot. I like the president. I am like the happiest dude in America right now.
Here's a guy who will say anything to stay in office. Lindsey Graham can't lead us in any direction because he traded his moral compass for petty political gain.
I like it. That was Jamie Harrison's video officially announcing his run to take on Republican Senator Lindsey Graham for Senate in 2020. And Jamie joins us now. He's the former chairman of the South Carolina Democratic Party and currently the associate chairman of the DNC. Also with us, former chief of staff to the DCCC and a former director of strategic communications for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, Adrienne Elrod. She's an MSNBC contributor and author of How the Right Lost Its Mind, also an MSNBC contributor. Charlie Sykes is with us.
Great to have you. Great to have everybody here. Jamie, you know, and I'm dead serious, you could actually use all of Lindsey Graham's quotes.
Own words.
That's what we're planning to do.
To not only attack the President of the United States, but Lindsey, because you're right. He said the president was unfit, that Donald Trump is unfit to be president, said if Republicans nominated him, they would be destroyed and they deserved it. I mean, it's just on and on. Nobody said harsher things about Donald Trump than Lindsey Graham.
Well, and Donald Trump said harsh things about Lindsey Graham. We just released a video last night because Lindsey and Donald were continuing their love fest down in Orlando, which basically had Donald Trump saying that Lindsey Graham wasn't fit to be elected dog catcher.
Right.
Remember
he gave out his phone number?
Yeah, exactly right.
Gosh.
We are going to allow Donald Trump and Lindsey Graham to continue to have a conversation.
Just keep going.
To keep going, and I don't have to.
Don't let us interrupt.
Yeah, I don't need. And it's going to be fun. I want Lindsey Graham to debate Lindsey Graham 1.0 to debate Lindsey Graham 2.0, and people will see the hypocrisy. He epitomizes why people don't like politics anymore.
Charlie, I mean, you want to, if there's one name, one face, one person that epitomizes the Republican Party's complete capitulation to Donald Trump, it would be Lindsey. I mean, I've known Lindsey since '94. I like him personally. It's hard not to like Lindsey personally, but to hear what he said during the campaign and then to see him flip-flop and then attack anybody who says anything bad about the President of the United States, that's like rich, even by Lindsey's standards.
Oh, it is. Marco Rubio, by the way, is giving him a run for his money here. But, we've talked a lot about capitulation and gutlessness or lack of a spine on the part of Republicans. But that's not the case with Lindsey Graham. More and more, I'm convinced, toadyism is a choice. This is somebody who worked alongside John McCain, who understands who John McCain was, and for a lot of us thought that he was going to go in that direction. But he's chosen to align himself with Donald Trump, even though he apparently has he has no illusions who Donald Trump is. So this is a choice that he has made. Sycophancy is a choice. And I think it really is, that is going to be Lindsey Graham's legacy.
Adrienne, what do you make of Jamie's strategy as you sit right next to him? But even more so, what Trump has done, among many things to the party, is make Republicans look like cartoon characters. This feels more extreme in terms of the types of things that Republicans are able to stomach in support of their president.
Well, when you look at the surface of this and the way that you are literally using Lindsey Graham's words against him, it seems to make sense. I think I am more interested, Jamie, in actually digging into the numbers and knowing that South Carolina tends to be more of a Republican state. How are you going to register more voters? What is your actual path in order to achieve victory?
So, South Carolina is very similar to Georgia in this aspect. There are a large number of unregistered African-American voters in the state, about 150,000, and a large number of Latino voters, about 50,000. There will be 2.1 million people who will vote in this next election. So unregistered voters alone, we have about 10% that could really change the electorate. And so we are going to go in, we're going to register those voters, we're going to give them a reason to come out and vote. And that's the real power. That's what Donald Trump was able to do, is give folks a reason who he felt that they felt that he was fighting for them. We're going to make sure that the folks in South Carolina understand that there's somebody that wants to fight for them.
And that makes sense, but look at this. President Trump's re-election kickoff yesterday proved to be a lucrative windfall for his campaign. According to GOP Chairwoman Ronna McDaniel, Trump raised nearly $25 million in less than 24 hours. John Heilman.
That ain't nothing.
That's not nothing, and the president is going to have all the advantages of being a incumbent president while the Democrats go through months of beating each other up. An incumbent president who's going to conserve his resources, and he's not going to have, all due respect to Bill Weld, not going to have a significant primary challenge. That's a thing that any incumbent president likes the idea of. I want to talk to Jamie.
Well, can I ask you really quickly before you go to Jamie? Is there, what is built in now to this system, to our political system, that has allowed the last three presidents, all who've been fairly divisive at times, they've run in a divisive climate? What's allowed them to be reelected? This is the first time since what? Maybe the 1800s, early 1800s, that we've had three incumbents winning re-election in a row. So what is it? Has it become too hard for a challenger to beat the power of incumbency?
I think, look, the reality is that this goes to a thing we talked about earlier in the show, this big trend towards polarization. And by that, I don't mean just the divisiveness and the vilification, but the hardening of the tribalism of the politics, that you start, that the center is produced almost nothing. The number of votes in play is almost none. People who are ticket splitters don't exist anymore. Democrat and Republican walk in with high floors and low ceilings, and you're competing for a very narrow sliver of vote. And because an incumbent, for the reasons we just talked about, has a certain advantage, they don't have to go through a primary fight. They can conserve their resources. They can spend months and months and months figuring out how to put together 270 electoral votes. That, with the built-in base that they have and so little available vote to compete for, gives that power of incumbency is enhanced, I think, in a very polarized environment for those reasons. I would say, though, that one of the things, to go back to another thing you were talking about earlier today, is this big demographic change that's happening in the country. And I want to talk to Jamie about it, because I think, we've seen in these polls with Donald Trump that suddenly, wow, Georgia's in play. Now that's a state that we've been a little focused on as a potential battleground state in past cycles. Arizona, Georgia are the targets, maybe Texas. South Carolina, people don't talk about that way, but the same demographic changes that are happening in Atlanta and in Georgia broadly are also happening in Charleston and other places in South Carolina. So is this the moment where the demographic change, as much as Lindsey Graham's weakness, but the demographic changes to your state have opened the door to someone like you? It has opened a door, and it's the reason why we won a congressional seat in South Carolina. We won Mark Sanford's seat. For the first time in 30 years, a Democrat is representing that seat, and who ran against a Trump sycophant. The young woman who ran against him said that she wanted to be the Kellyanne Conway of Congress, right? Donald Trump called into South Carolina, did all of this stuff, and the Democrats won that seat. It's because Charleston's changing. We have all these people moving into South Carolina who are thinking differently. And so we have a shot here. I know a lot of folks said, well, it's South Carolina. Well, remember, in 2008, Barack Obama lost Georgia by 7. He lost South Carolina by 8. Without doing anything in the state.
And won North Carolina.
And won North Carolina.
And won Indiana.
We are on the cusp of the birth of a new South. There's a renaissance that is taking place in the South, and this race is going to be the tip of the spear. And you look at Virginia, these numbers in Virginia, I mean, are really the most stunning. 17. Virginia, which used to be a purple state, is now a blue state.
Plus 17 in the latest polls that we've
seen. For Joe Biden, right?
Yeah, for Joe Biden over Donald Trump. Charlie, we've been talking this morning, spoke earlier with the great Ron Fournier from Michigan, talking about Macomb County. Why don't we get some insight from you, if that's okay? Tell us about Racine. Tell us about Kenosha. Tell us about other parts of Wisconsin.
Don't forget Oshkosh.
Oshkosh. Talk about the parts that are swing parts of that state. We've seen some polls that show Donald Trump getting pounded by double digits. Do you believe it, or do you think that Donald Trump still has a good shot of carrying Wisconsin again?
I think he does have a good chance of carrying Wisconsin again. It depends what the Democrats do. You know, I mean, everything that John said is absolutely true about the power of incumbency. And I think you saw a preview of what this campaign is going to look like last night, where Donald Trump's going to run on what? You know, safety, security, and the economy. But the flip side is he's also going to be running against those Democrats, and those Democrats who hate America, want to destroy America. It was really striking. I think 4 years ago, he ran as sort of the talk radio candidate. Now he's running as a full internet troll. So here's the question. If the Democrats move hard enough and fast enough to the left, if the Republicans can paint them as scary for open borders, weak on security, poised to trash the economy, you're going to have a lot of those swing voters in places like Appleton and Green Bay and Racine and Kenosha who might go, okay, we are sick and tired of Donald Trump, but at least that's the evil that we know. And so, Donald Trump doesn't need to win this election. He just needs the Democrats to be more toxic than he is. And he's proven in the past that he can do that.
Really quickly, Charlie, have you seen any anecdotal evidence of people peeling off of Donald Trump?
No, not really.
Yeah. Okay.
And this is part of the dynamic. And again, John mentioned the incredible polarization and tribalization and how much of our politics is this negative partisanship. Yep. I do think that with all of the things that we talk about and we look at and we talk about the norms that are being shattered and the outrages, that's almost been baked into the formula. People have accepted that. They understand that the president is a liar. They understand he's a narcissist. They understand that he's erratic. But they figure at least he is, he is not Bernie Sanders.
Weird.
He's not going to bring socialism.
Okay, Adrian, I want to take a look before we go at the debate stage. Let's look at day one. My gut is Elizabeth Warren stands out in a big way, and she's the one to watch. Claire McCaskill thought Amy might really stand out that night. What are you thinking on day one?
Yeah, I agree with your assessment and Claire's assessment. I think Elizabeth Warren is going to rise to the occasion. I think this is a moment for her to really, talk about her policies in a way that millions and millions of people are going to see, as opposed to, some of the lower numbers in the forums.
Yep.
I do think somebody like Amy will stand out. I think somebody like Beto will stand out, and I do think actually Tim Ryan will do very well.
I agree.
Joe's thought is that's the
to
dark
that
horse
middle
there.
class, middle sector of
Cory
the
Booker also.
Let's look at let's look at day two, and the one to watch, obviously, Joe Biden. I think it'll be interesting to see Buttigieg and Biden pair up.
Me too. Boy, the contrast, right? Sort of the next generation of our party versus the older generation. I think in this first debate, Joe Biden can rise above the fray. He can, paint himself as the presidential candidate, the one who's sort of already achieved the nomination to an extent, which is sort of the tack that he's been taking in some of these states. But I think after this debate, he's got to be very careful not to look like the inevitable candidate.
Yeah.
Because if you go out to some of these early states and you act like you've already got this nomination locked up, you can get yourself in a lot of trouble.
Yeah. Interesting. Bernie's campaign. I'm going to ask you what's going on there. I talk with all the candidates. I text with some of them or their top people. Silence from Bernie. Yeah.
Probably
it's
not
weird.
smart.
Not calm. Yeah. No. I wouldn't say. I don't know. I don't get what's going on there.
Ask Jamie what he thinks about Bernie's campaign.
Okay, Jamie.
They're all in South Carolina, and they're trying to help me send Lindsey home. So go to JamieHarrison.com.
That's great.
All right. Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Charlie Sides.
Thanks, guys. This is
we really appreciate
really
you being
good.
there.
Adrian, stay with us.
Coming up next, what do we have, Mika?
Great show this morning. Our next guest, our next topic kind of hurts. Quote, your professional decline is coming much sooner than you think.
Oh, good.
Author and columnist Arthur Brooks explains why next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.